Let's see here. We have a little book of Thomas Jefferson quotes, one of our founding fathers. This is good. Let's see here. A little rebellion now and then is a good thing, and as necessary in the political world as storms in the physical. Can't be right. Let's see what Thomas Jefferson had to say elsewhere. Thomas Jefferson, American founding father. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Tom. It's actually, I don't wear glasses, and this isn't even a book of quotes. It's a dictionary, but it looks old. So, anyways, here's the video. That's right, you just heard some quotes from American founding father Thomas Jefferson on what he thought of rebellion, and it might be surprising to you, but he was pro-rebellion. Jefferson actually went on to say that every 20 years there should be some sort of rebellion. And if you thought all the rebellion was over when the Treaty of Paris was signed and we now have the United States of America, well then you were wrong, because under the Articles of Confederation, you remember the Articles of Confederation, that was the government that was the worst, or maybe not, but anyways, under the Articles of Confederation, you had a lot of disgruntled people, you had some problems with other nations, and we're going to talk about all those things in today's episode, so let's get into it. Here we go. The young United States of America would have been crazy to expect all the nations of Europe to leave the young nation alone as we try to figure out this whole government thing by ourselves. And really what we see is, during the time from the end of the War for Independence, all the way up until we actually get our firm constitution that we still live under today, we had lots of problems with lots of different countries, and we had lots of problems with our own country. The first country we're going to talk about as far as problems go is our good old friend, and by friend I mean enemy, I mean founding nation, mother country. Anyways, Great Britain. Great Britain, believe it or not, did not like the fact that they lost a war to their own colonies. It was almost as if they were bitter or upset or something. The first problem that we had with them was the fact that they actually didn't remove any of their troops from their western forts. You remember all those western forts from like the French and Indian War and even during the War for Independence. The British basically just sat in them and said, make us move. And the Articles of Confederation did raise a continental army and maintain that army. However, they weren't about to send that army out to go fight against the British. The British justified their staying in these forts by saying that America had defaulted on some of its loans and debts that they had outstanding with the British Empire from during the war and then after the war. So as long as we couldn't pay these debts, they were going to keep their troops in those forts. So this allowed the British to keep up their lucrative fur trade here on North American soil, and it would be some time before we could actually kick the British out of these forts. So we just kind of left them alone in the woods there. As long as they didn't bother us, we weren't going to go out there and start any trouble with them, but they were there, and that's unsettling. The next thing that Great Britain was upset with the United States about was the treatment of the Loyalists. You remember the Loyalists? Well, actually you don't remember the Loyalists because we didn't do any videos on the War for Independence. But the Loyalists were the people who sided with the British during the conflict between the colonies and their mother country. And the Loyalists after the war were actually being treated very poorly. The Loyalists, they live in America, and after the War for Independence was over, you can imagine that the Patriots and the winners of that war looked at the Loyalists in a very negative light. They were being treated pretty poorly. Some of them were even killed for siding with the British during the War for Independence. The British were upset about this. They felt that people who actually remained loyal to them should not be persecuted for their beliefs. Definitely the biggest problem that we had with the British was in the Atlantic Ocean. You see, the United States wanted to keep up a lot of its trade, but Great Britain wasn't too keen on trading with a nation that just defeated them. Also, you know, hey, if they could shut us out of trade, they would. Another practice that was begun during this time was the idea of impressment. We'll talk more about this as we get close to the War of 1812, but the British Navy was basically capturing American merchant ships, taking the crew off of those ships and then forcing them to serve in the British Navy. This was making the Americans pretty upset, but again, there wasn't a whole lot we could do with it. We had a weak central government, we had an army that was, you know, our navy was almost non-existent. And so Britain was pretty much punking us here for quite some time. All right, so we're gonna throw a map up on the screen here right now, and you'll see the results of the Treaty of Paris. Look at all that land that the United States now has. Canada remains pretty much a British possession all the way through and through. And then you see Spain is actually coming out on top here in the Treaty of Paris. They received a lot of land in the New World, and Spain would be a country that we also had some problems with. So Spain was obviously worried about a new country like the United States moving and expanding west, and they had a good reason to be. It was definitely something that was on every American's mind, was controlling this continent from sea to shining sea, manifest destiny. They might not have said it back then, but they definitely believed it in their American heart of hearts. They employed a strategy of stirring up Native American tribes, especially in the southeast and west, to raid American settlements and basically make life miserable for the Americans that are living there, to discourage Americans from moving west and having conflict between the United States of America and Spanish claims in North America. Another big issue that came up between the young United States of America and Spain itself was an idea called the right of deposit. And this right of deposit was the idea that American merchants could sail their goods down the Mississippi River on a flatboat. We'll talk about those here in a few chapters, and basically leave their goods in the port city waiting for the ships that are buying them and picking them up to pick them up and take them away. We'd been doing this for some time with the French. It used to be in New Orleans. Now New Orleans belongs to Spain for a little while, and Spain didn't like the idea of American goods sitting in their port cities without any sort of revenue coming their way. So they take away the right of deposit, and this angers many American merchants. So what do? We send in our best negotiator, the future first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, John Jay himself. He negotiated that awesome Treaty of Paris. We send him to Spain, and he comes back with a great treaty. Actually, nobody liked his treaty. When he came back, it was not that great. We kind of had the right of deposit, but Spain was like, we're going to charge you a lot of money for leaving your stuff here in our port. And we were just kind of like, okay, I guess that's just how it's going to work now. So John Jay, you can't hit a home run every time. Sometimes you strike out, and this was one of those. And so there was this tension between Spain and the United States at this time as well. Two countries that we also need to make note of are the Netherlands and France, and both of these are countries that loaned money and or assistance, or both, to the Americans during the War for Independence against Great Britain. And while they weren't necessarily like collecting debts like that day, they were pretty concerned that this new nation, this apparently broke new nation that couldn't wage taxes against its own people, would not be able to pay back their debt, and they were kind of right about that. So they were also a little peeved and a little miffed here at the young United States of America. What are we going to do? The Articles of Confederation is a little scary, and now let's get into something that actually makes it very scary. What happens when your own people turn against you? Alright, so we talked about the problems that we were having with other nations, but those nations, more or less, are far away and in Europe, and they have some influence here in North America, but we were able to kind of insulate ourselves against them. When we had problems in our own country, that's when things get a little sticky. And this is where Thomas Jefferson's quote about a little rebellion every now and then is really going to come into play. When the War for Independence ended, you had lots of soldiers from the Continental Army that now had nowhere to fight. They went home to their farms, they went home to their businesses, and many of their farms and businesses were not in good shape, and they were worried about how this was going to be rectified. Furthermore, some states, like Massachusetts, promised to repay war debts to individual soldiers. But in order to do this, these states decided that they were going to tax their residents to raise money to pay back the war debt. If you're wondering how that's going to work, you're pretty smart, because how are you going to tax people that need money because of the war debt to raise money for the war debt? It just, something's not going to work out quite like you think, Massachusetts. Bankruptcy was a common problem for many Americans here in the early years after the War for Independence, and that just made matters worse. Mix all this together and you have a recipe for a little bit of a conflict, and that's what happens in western Massachusetts, at this time still very much the frontier. And you have some frontier farmers who fought for the Continental Army in the American War for Independence, and their own government, the government that they fought to have and fought to free from the tyranny of Great Britain, is not paying them the money that's owed to them. And then on top of that, they're charging more money. I mean, this was basically why we were upset at the British in the first place. And there was a group of farmers from western Massachusetts led by a man by the name of Daniel Shays. And Daniel Shays was the perpetrator that marched an angry mob of farmers into the capital city of Massachusetts and basically shut down the Massachusetts state court system. Now, if something like this was to happen today, which, kind of has happened recently. Yikes. If something like this was to happen today, there are lots of different avenues that the state could choose to deal with this problem. But if things get really bad, you can always call in the United States military to take care of any issues like this. Well, the governor of Massachusetts literally had no one to call because the states wanted their rights to control, and the Continental Army was not under the beck and call of the state governor. And so basically he had to raise his own militia from Massachusetts citizens, so he had to find some that weren't mad at him, and convince those guys to fight against these other Massachusetts citizens, many of whom might have agreed with the guys they were fighting against. And what you do have is an eventual standoff, some shots are fired, some people are killed, but more or less the rebels disperse, and Shays Rebellion is put down by the militia. But news of this travels all throughout the states, all throughout our young nation. It terrifies many people, among those people George Washington. George Washington and many of the early leaders like him were not about to see the country that they fought Great Britain in order to have fall apart because of rebellions due to inept state and local government. And so they hatch a plan. Many of these men agreed to meet in Annapolis, Maryland. This meeting was to deal with lots of different issues, bring up some different things that were plaguing the states and plaguing the Articles of Confederation at that time. The Annapolis Convention, as is known in history, invited many delegates from all 13 of the states. Not every state was represented. A lot of states didn't send delegates. And really the Annapolis Convention was pretty unsuccessful if you look at what it actually accomplished. It didn't really do anything. However, it did lay the groundwork for a second meeting, and that second meeting is a big one. It took place in Philadelphia. They met in Independence Hall, which is where they signed the Declaration of Independence. And this Philadelphia Convention eventually turns into what is remembered in history as the Constitutional Convention. Scared that more rebellions like Shays Rebellion would begin to plague the states here in the young United States of America, some of the greatest minds of the time agreed to meet to amend and try to change some things that were wrong with the Articles of Confederation. There were some obvious weaknesses. People were taking advantage of the national government at home. People were taking advantage of it abroad. And so they decided we got to meet together and we got to address these issues. So they do that. After a few months, you have about 55 delegates from all over the United States. Almost every state sends an initial delegate, and eventually all states send a delegate to what becomes known as not just the Philadelphia Convention, but pretty soon the Constitutional Convention. So as we said, the Philadelphia Convention met originally to amend the Articles of Confederation, fix some things that were wrong. What they realized as they went through and tried to discuss and air their grievances, all of these meetings were agreed to be kept secret for 30 years so that all the delegates could actually say what they felt was necessary to be said without fear of constituents or fear of people from their states becoming upset with them. And what they realized as they worked through the Articles of Confederation is that this government is broke. And I mean, most people would have told you that it was broke. It gave the states too much power. It didn't have enough power from the federal government. There was no way to raise money. There were a lot of issues with it. And so these men agree to set up a new constitution and a new government for the United States of America. The Constitutional Convention is underway, and it's quite the star-studded event if you look at it from a historical perspective. Elected as the president and chairman of the convention is the one and only George Washington. His leadership of the Continental Army during the American War for Independence earned him some major points with his peers. He was well respected, well liked, and he was a great leader in American history. He led this convention to set up a new constitution in our country. Along with Washington, you have another all-star and eventual U.S. president in James Madison. James Madison served as kind of like the secretary of the convention. His writings are much of what we know about what took place in Independence Hall for those few months as the Constitutional Convention met. He's also known as the father of the Constitution, and this name is given to him because he wrote down and actually penned the words that we would see in the Constitution even today. Along with James Madison and George Washington, you have the OG American patriot, Benjamin Franklin himself. He's like 82 or 83 at this time, and he has seen every part of the American colonies and their history. And his perspective is invaluable. His leadership, his humor, his outlook, all these things are super helpful to the Constitutional Convention. He even encourages them to pause for some time and to go to churches and pray and seek the Lord's face as they begin to undertake this amazing task of building a nation from scratch, or rebuilding a nation from the Articles of Confederation. And finally, the last notable attendee of the Constitutional Convention that we'll talk about in this lesson was Alexander Hamilton. Now, he's pretty popular nowadays because of the awesome musical Hamilton, but Alexander Hamilton was a major voice in the beefing up and strengthening of the central government. He also was very concerned with the national debt that we had accumulated a lot of and how to repay our loans to all these different nations. How do we keep from going bankrupt as a new country? Alexander Hamilton was worried about that, and he did a lot to help that. Now, in the back of every yearbook, there's always the page that says not pictured, and they list a bunch of kids that weren't there on picture day. And if the Constitutional Convention was a yearbook, here's the not pictured page. Guys like John Hancock and Sam Adams just didn't go. They didn't feel like this was something that should be happening. These were guys that also were for strong state and local government, so they didn't like the idea that a new government was being hashed out. These guys were strong proponents of state and local government, so they didn't like the idea of the Articles of Confederation being amended or a new constitution being hashed out that favored a strong central government. So instead of dissenting, they just stayed away. And then another key early American patriot that stayed away from the Constitutional Convention because, according to him, he smelled a rat. That was Patrick Henry. Mr. Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death myself decided to stay away from the Constitutional Convention, and that's what happens here at Independence Hall. In the next video, we're going to look at what the Founding Fathers in the Constitutional Convention came up with as they sat down to figure out how to fix the Articles of Confederation, as they eventually scrapped the Articles of Confederation in favor of this new Constitution. Thanks for watching today. We'll check you next time. These videos always end up being longer than I expect them to be, but anyways, a lot of good content. Comment below what you liked the best. Like the video, subscribe. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.